Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, we're going to look at two genres that seem to be a contradiction. Punk, as in punk rock, and jazz. But wait, there's more of a connection than you think. So let's look at the world of punk jazz. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to 20th Century Music and Arts. Again, this is me on the mic. There is no AI here, just me with all my errors. The term punk evolved out of the idea of, returning rock and roll to its basics. Jazz is a genre that kind of emphasizes the complex rhythms using, a musical dexterity of very accomplished players. Now, again, these two genres may at first seem to be sort of polar opposites. However, punk rock encouraged people to pick up instruments again, who maybe didn't want to do so, and inevitably that led to a desire to experiment. And the experiments that many jazz musicians did, and they engaged in, was about pushing the boundaries of tonality and melody, and sometimes creating shocking sounds and obtuse rhythms, really trying to challenge the audience. So, this approach seems to fit well with the kind of confrontational attitude of punk rock. So hey, let's look at this idea, this concept of punk jazz, or jazz punk. Now, the history of punk rock's fascination with jazz music goes right back to the beginning of the genre. If you look at proto-punk, you gotta talk about, the Stooges and MC5, and they were totally into free jazz musicians, people like Sun Ra, Ornette Coleman, Albert Ayler, John Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders, and all those kinds of players. Now, MC5, as I've mentioned on earlier videos, they used to cover the track Upper and Lower Egypt by Pharoah Sanders, and one time they even opened up for Sun Ra. And with the Stooges, if you check out the second side of their album Funhouse, they embrace a freeform jazz sound. They got saxophonist Steve McKay on there, and he's jamming these noisy sounds with the rest of the band. So, right from the beginning of this idea of punk rock, there was always this kind of jazz influence. Now, the term punk will first be connected with the music scene happening at CBGB's and Max's Kansas City in the early to mid-70s. And one of the key bands out of that scene was Television. But Television, they did not play a kind of three-chord garage rock. Guitarists Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd, they'd engage in a complex guitar interplay that was directly inspired by those sax players like John Coltrane and Albert Ayler. This amazing jazz-inspired dexterity could be heard on their debut single Little Johnny Jewel and throughout their debut album Marquee Moon, particularly on the title track. And one-time bassist for Television, Richard Hell, he would form his own group, Richard Hell and the Voidoid. Now, lead guitarist Robert Quine, Oxley, along with the rhythm guitarist Ivan Julian, they would create these obtuse, noisy guitar bits, especially the guitar leads of Quine, and they were directly inspired by free jazz and, the electric period of Miles Davis, especially the album On the Corner. Now, if you get Richard Hell and the Voidoid's album Blank Generation, you can hear this sound. Now, punk, when it's swept through Britain, it allowed many people who, again, might have not picked up an instrument to do so. And there were so many people who were picking up instruments who were definitely into avant-garde jazz. Now, for example, the debut album by X-Ray Spex. Well, it's very much a punk album. It's full of great saxophone squalls. And one of those saxophone players, Laura Logic, she would form her own band, Essential Logic, and their debut would come out in 1979. Lots of crazy rhythms and sax squalls on this album. But there was one band that would really bring the avant-garde jazz to the forefront and right into what was called post-punk now. And that would be, of course, the Pop Group. I mean, they're amazing. They would fuse funk, noise, dub reggae, and a whole lot of free jazz into their kind of intense cacophony. You really have to check out their albums, Why and How Long Do We Tolerate Mass Murder? Now, two members would join the band Rip, Rig, and Panic, their name actually coming from an album by jazz musician Roland Kirk. And these guys, they fuse reggae, world music, and free jazz. And another group that was connected with the pop group was Pig Bag. And they fused kind of funk, ska, reggae, and world music also with jazz. I know that Weather Report had a song called, I believe, Punk Jazz, but I don't know if it really fits in what we're talking about here. But let's go over to the no wave scene in New York. Now, no wave, they took this non-musical approach to music and believed in the concept of using noise to completely deconstruct the sound of rock, like tear it just limb from limb and away from its tradition. But you know what? With that approach, avant-garde jazz fits nicely because it's kind of doing the same thing with jazz in many ways. Now, not only were the musicians in the no wave movement inspired by free jazz, three of the musicians would actually use jazz music in their related projects. So the first artist we need to look at is Lydia Lunch, and she started the no wave band Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. I mean, this band made so much noise and chaos, it was just insane, and it's completely non-musical. Then she would go on to do some other music as well. She has one album called The Queen of Siam, and this album is like a dark, surreal, nihilistic take on cabaret jazz. And the jazz influence would be heard on Lydia Lunch's next band called Eight Eye Spy, which would have elements of jazz deconstructed, but blues and rock deconstructed as well. Now, one artist that was in the original lineup of Teenage Jesus and the Jerks was James Chance. Now, James Chance would form a new band called The Contortions, or James Chance and the Contortions. Now, Chance would both sing and play saxophone in this band. The Contortions would play an aggressive combination of like punk, confrontational aspects with James Brown rhythm and a whole lot of freeform jazz, where Chance's solos would channel the spirit of Albert Ayler. You know, you really got to check out the Contortions debut album, just called By Contortions. Chance, his real name was actually Sigfield. He would take on sort of other personas like James White and form a band called James White and the Blacks. And you know, Chance would actually continue making music throughout the decades, but unfortunately would pass away in 2024 from gastrointestinal disease.
And why don't you just follow apart? You better try being stupid instead of smart.
Now, the last person we got to talk about is Arda Lindsay. Lindsay played the most reconstructed primitive form of guitar noise in the new wave band DNA. But after that, he would play in another band called the Lounge Lizards with brothers John and Evan Lurie and bassist Steve Piccolo and drummer Anton Fear. They created this instrumental sound that embraced elements of no wave and free jazz, but interjected them with the sort of traditional jazz references stylistically and with their whole aesthetic in a really kind of self-referential and postmodern kind of way with lots of irony. On their 1981 self-titled debut, they do these crazy takes on Thelonious Monk's covers like Well You Needn't and Epistrophe. You know, but there were quite a few other amazing acts that were operating in New York in the late 1970s and early 80s. You know, inspired by saxophonist Ornette Coleman, whom he regularly played with, we have James Blood Ulmer. He created a sound that fused Coleman's harmonic approach to jazz with rock, funk, and blues. He's got so many great albums, and this is, again, more coming out of the jazz world, but it's very, very kind of dissonant. So you got to check out his albums from that period, like Tales of Captain Black, Are You Glad to Be in America, Freelancing, and Black Rock. Now, Fred Frith, he's in New York now, and he's the very unique guitar player from the British band Henry Cow. He also formed a really cool instrumental band called Massacre, and they play this kind of stripped down instrumental music, and it's got the aggression of punk, but it's got the obtuse sounds of avant-garde jazz. It's really quite unique. The trio was actually composed Firth on guitar, Bill Laswell on bass, and Fred Marr on drums. You really got to check out their 1981 album, Killing Time. And the last band that should be mentioned is Borbetomagus. I hope I pronounced that right. And this is just crazy saxophone noise stuff. They're combining saxophone, guitar, and electronic noise. This sound is so abrasive, but it would actually be very influential on the Japanese noise scene. But you know what? We've talked a lot about jazz there. Let's get back to the punkier side of things. Let's go all the way over to Australia. The Australian punk band The Saints. They actually released this album in 1978 called Prehistoric Sounds. Now, guitarist Ed Kruper, he incorporated the influence of jazz, and he brought in a brass section on several tracks, especially the opener, Swing for the Crime. But it would be his next band where he would really integrate jazz into the sound. The Laughing Clowns was the name of that band. And on their 1982 album, Mr. Udich Schmudich Goes to Town, the band kind of infuses horn playing into their rocky post-punk sound. It's a real kind of Beefheartian cacophony, and it brings jazz right to the forefront. And they would release several albums after this, of course. Now, we're going to go right into the world of American hardcore punk. And the band that was the first to play at sort of the absolute breakneck speed was the Bad Brains. And you know what? They actually started out as a jazz fusion band called Mind Power. And it was probably due to the amazing musicianship of the players that they were able to create insanely fast yet complex punk rhythms. Now, interesting fact is that the Bad Brains would eventually release one album on the label SST. They released albums earlier, but they had one on SST, Eye Against Eye. Now, that label had numerous artists that fused punk and jazz together. Now, let's start out with the founder of the label, Greg Ginn, and his band Black Flag. While Black Flag certainly started out as a hardcore punk band, by the mid-1980s, they would integrate some real atonal sounds inspired by free jazz and jazz fusion. They even had all-instrumental releases. Family Man, well, on side 2 anyway, and another all-instrumental album called The Process of Weeding Out. And Gant had listened to this other instrumental band that he liked called Regressive 8. And this band also fused jazz fusion with punk. And brought in the rhythm so he brings in the rhythm section from that band, the bassist and the drummer, to form his own instrumental band, Gone. And again, they play this intense instrumental jazz-inspired heavy jam. Now that same rhythm section would go on to play with Henry Rollins and the Rollins Band, and where there was lots of jazz-inspired heaviness. That was a key part of their sound. Now that's the whole family tree from Black Flag, but then we gotta go to look at the other bands that were on that label, SST. Of course, we've got the trio, the Minutemen, who would play these incredibly complex rhythms that were jazz-like with all kinds of time signatures. And they do this all in a 1-minute song. You really got to check out their incredible albums, The Punchline, What Makes a Man Start Fires, and of course the amazing double album, Double Nickels on a Dime. Now, unfortunately, guitarist and singer D. Boon would die in a car accident in 1986. But the band Firehose would form, and the bassist and drummer would continue to make music in that band, and there's lots of jazz-inspired rhythms there too. Now, Joe Baiza would form the band Saccharine Trust, and they were also on SST, and they started out more as a post-punk inspired hardcore band, but the jazz influence kept on coming, and by 1986 they were really taking cues from jazz fusion. And Baiza's next band, Universal Congress of, which was also on SST, had even more jazz influence playing, and they would turn into kind of this avant-garde freeform jazz band. And then you've got other bands like Bazooka and Hotel X that were basically jazz groups that brought in the kind of intensity of punk into their sound. But Europe, there's lots of cool things going on there. So we'll start back in the UK. I want to talk about the band Blurt. This English band, it plays a kind of mutant funk, avant-garde, jazz post-punk. And the bassist for this trio was singer Ted Milton, who also had saxophone player, and he'd squeal in between reciting his existential poetry with guitar and drums filling out the sound. Band is very unique. And next we have a really cool band who I really have to do a show on called Big Flame. Big Flame, they're also a British band. Again, they play this totally chaotic Cat and Beefheart post-punk noise that is definitely taking cues from free jazz. Amazing stuff. And here's another band I definitely have to do a show on, and that's The X. They started out as sort of this anarcho-punk band. They're from the Netherlands. But, they started integrating all these other sounds, and it was world music and definitely jazz, especially free-form improvised jazz, into their sound, particularly with the album Joggers and Smoggers. And they had these two incredible albums, Scrambling at the Lock and The Weathermen Shrug Their Shoulders. And they were collaborations with the cellist Tom Cora. But they've done numerous albums since then with all kinds of collaborations, and again, they've got a huge catalog. And one band they did a collaboration with was Dog-Faced Hermans out of Scotland. This group combines punk, folk, noise, and jazz. They even covered Peace Warriors by Ornette Coleman. But you know what? Let's fly back to the United States. I have to mention the great Fishbone. Fishbone fused punk, funk, ska, reggae, and soul, but they gradually started incorporating more jazz elements, particularly in the albums The Reality of My Surroundings and Give a Monkey a Brain and He'll Swear He's the Center of the Universe. Now there's this other very unique band that comes out of New York in the 1980s called Phantom Tollbooth. Not many people know them. They're really, really cool. They incorporate a lot of jazz into their sort of noisy art rock sound. But in the world of hardcore punk, there's so many bands that are getting interested in the complexity of jazz into their sound. First one I want to talk about is Beefeater. This DC band, they're of course on Discord Records, took cues from the Minutemen's fast-paced hardcore and again, they got these really crazy jazz-influenced timing. But you know what? The band that brought the highest level of musicianship to the world of hardcore punk is hands down No Means No. This trio out of Victoria, BC, Canada would play like breakneck speed punk rock with the complexity of like a jazz fusion band. The bass playing is unbelievable.
You hear that sound? You hear that sound? Like fingers scratching underground.
You have to hear it. Another band I need to do a series on. Now, one band that played music in kind of a similar fashion and were great friends with No Means No were Victims Family. Really check out their albums as well. Real complex jazz fusion timing, but heavy and intense. Cool stuff. Now, let's go back to Washington, D.C. again, and we got to look at the great band, The Nation of Ulysses, who would really incorporate free jazz into their sound. And, of course, they reference John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman into their song titles. And, then, of course, there's all this math rock in bands like Don Caballero and Fred Armisen of Saturday Night Live. He was in this band called Trenchmouth. And then we got the post-rock of Tortoise. All of these bands are incorporating elements of jazz into their sound. Really, really cool. But you know what? Let's see what people are doing that are directly coming from the jazz world. Saxophonist and composer John Soren, he would create music that would be, it incorporated numerous genres into his jazz sound. But he also included the extremes of like hardcore punk, metal, and noise music. Two bands he formed, Naked City and Painkiller, really pushed these extremes in the jazz world. And we're in the 90s now, but let's go back to the 80s. Sonny Chirac, he's a jazz guitarist who experimented with noise going right back to the 1960s. He would hook up with the free jazz saxophonist Peter Brotzman from Germany and drummer Ronald Shannon Jackson and bassist Bill Laswell again. And they formed this group called Last Exit. And this was like free-form improvisation with the volume up to be like a metal or punk band. You have guys like guitarist Elliot Sharp, he making forays into the noise rock too. And Sonny Chirac would sometimes play with Robert Musil's band Machine Gun. And again, another jazz band that really turned up the volume. And then Peter Brott's son from Last Exit, his son Casper would form his own band Massacre, different one spelled with a K. They created a free rock where the distorted guitar was turned up to the highest volume. And in many ways, this really captures the spirit of what you're trying to do with a jazz concept by integrating it into rock. It's just incredible stuff. You know, and then we get to the 90s, and there's just so many bands to mention, and I can't mention them all, I'm sorry. But there are so many people incorporating jazz into the punk rock sound. Some interesting, maybe lesser known ones you want to check out are like bands that's like Spongehead or Coltrane Wreck. There's this band called Cap'n Jazz, and they're one of the early emo bands, but they've got this jazz timing thing going on in their sound and, of course, in their name. And then there's this amazing scene out of Chicago with bands like the Flying Lutenbachers, right? And there's a ton of other bands that go up there, too. And again, they're combining this extreme punk noise with freeform jazz. You know, I'm sorry, there's just too much to cover here. But you know what? Let's end, because this is 20th century music and arts. We're going to end with the end of the 90s, the beginning of the millennium there. So a couple of albums we want to talk about is the Refused album out of Sweden, hardcore punk band, and they do an album called The Shape of Punk to Come, which of course referenced the Ornette Coleman album, The Shape of Jazz to Come. But you know, there's a lot of jazz sounds as well as other stuff in their intense hardcore punk. And then in 2000, jazz fusion guitarist David Wushinski, probably pronounced that wrong. He has a whole album called Jazz Punk, which fused the attitude and volume of punk rock with his fusion style playing, or that's what the title says. But it's pretty awesome stuff. Now again, these two styles are not necessarily that far apart. Jazz, particularly free jazz, was about, you know, breaking down the barriers of structure to unearth the possibilities underneath. And punk rock was about rebelling against the conformity in rock music. So there's really no wonder that so many musicians would be inspired by both genres. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Again, please like, share, subscribe. Please subscribe to my channel. And a comment. Do you know any of these artists? Do you know any jazz punk that you like? Please comment. Thank you.